Hi everyone, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us in this second event within Edinburgh Printmakers' new The Art of Printmaking series, which is going to be running every Wednesday at 5 p.m. And we're bringing artists that have been part of our recent programme and are forthcoming together in these conversations. My name is Tiffany Boyle, and since July, I have been Edinburgh Printmakers' programme producer, working on our exhibitions, events and residencies, and it's really my pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Glasgow-based artist Hardeep Pandhal. Before we get started this evening, in terms of housekeeping, I just wanted to flag up that this event is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and our website in terms of our archive. So Hardeep and I are going to be in conversation for the best part of 40 minutes, after which we'd like to invite audience questions. So in order to do so, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And if you can use that to type in your questions, the chat has been disabled, so we won't be able to see any questions there. So to introduce Hardeep, Hardeep Pandhal is an artist working across digital animations, drawing, textile work and multimedia installations, who lives and works in Glasgow, having kind of been raised in Birmingham. He was born in 1985. He received a Leverhulme scholarship to complete his MFA at the Glasgow School of Art in 2013, after studying for his undergraduate at Leeds Met. Recent solo exhibitions include Confessions of a Thug, Pachelbel at Tramway in Glasgow, Paranoid Picnic, The Phantom BME at New Art Exchange and Primary in Nottingham, Self-Loading Flash Mob for Glasgow International in 2018, and recent group exhibitions include the British Art Show, which just closed up at Aberdeen Art Gallery Museum this past weekend, Is This Tomorrow at Whitechapel in 2019, the 2018 Triennale at New Museum, and in 2018 he was also shortlisted for the Film London German Award, and he's represented by the Gallery Javeri Contemporary. So without any further ado, we're going to get started. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so we have the slideshow. Hope you can all see that. So Hardeep, when I think of your work, I think of a clash, a productive clash between analog and digital, and a means of storytelling which mashes up imagery and influences from video games, archives, graffiti, rap, cinema, particularly the film Scarface, and your own autobiography, your own life, particularly your collaboration with your mum on specific artworks. And my first encounter with your work was for Glasgow International back in 2014 with the project Jojo Boys, which incorporated imagery from the historic Glasgow-produced brand Camp Coffee, which you then kind of intertwined with archival research and a sense of fiction. And as a mean to begin introducing your practice here, I wondered if you could talk about that project briefly to give everyone a sense of how you work.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for the introduction too. So yeah, that's an image related to that sort of project, and it was a graduate sort of opportunity. I think it was the first year. It was called like a graduate bursary, so it was, you know, available to recent graduates within Scotland or Glasgow, I believe. And the stipulations were that to get the project, you would have to do something or propose something that was perhaps off-site or outwit for a gallery, conventional gallery studio setting, and also that the project would somehow relate to Glasgow historically, or, you know, in terms of the space, or just have a sort of connection. And I remember sort of thinking about the Camp Coffee logo before this, and I thought, this might be a good opportunity to sort of bring some of that into this project, because it would necessarily, it would have, you know, forced me to, or push me into sort of like looking around the history of the company, Camp Coffee, which was based in Glasgow, and the first thing that they made was a coffee substitute in liquid form, and it was called Camp Coffee, and it had chicory in it, I think, and I think the reason it was popular amongst perhaps the military was that it could be consumed quite quickly, being in liquid form. And that's the story behind the significance of that product. And also the logo had depicted a kind of a Highland sort of soldier being served the product. And this was the initial logo, and which would have sprung up around the turn of the century. And the product was being served by a sort of a servant, essentially, and then maybe halfway through the century, the logo changed, so the servant was still kind of servile in a position of offering the coffee, but it was empty-handed. I should point out that it was sort of Asiatic, sort of, you know, Orientalist kind of like imagery. And then the current one, it still exists, you can still buy it, depicts both of the characters sort of on an equal footing, as it were, enjoying the coffee. So I just felt that the current one kind of maybe omitted, or kind of gleaned over or glossed over, perhaps, or even sanitized, potentially kind of a narrative there or history. And this was, back, 2014. This was a long, so there was a big sort of survey of contemporary art in Scotland, which was called Generation, which also occurred at that time. And if you look at the list of those artists, I don't recall there being much kind of conversation around sort of Scotland's sort of connection to the empire around those times. So it just felt like kind of important and sort of relevant to me. But since then, like the exhibition that I was involved with you at the Printmaker studio, seemed very, very much central. This is kind of central to the conversation now. So yeah, that project, just to go back, entailed making a series of lamppost banners, which were printed. I designed them digitally, and then I defaced them, or sort of scrawled over them with acrylic, and had them installed in Glasgow on Charlotte Street near Glasgow Green, which is where the original Camp Coffee factory once stood. It has since been demolished, and I think there's some construction going on there, or there has been for many years, but it's quite a sort of bland, kind of nondescript sort of street just outside the city. I think there's an insurance company there. And also actually there's a plaque that marks David Dale, incidentally, the merchant. So yeah, and then we had a live reading by the author Jake Arnott, who wrote a sort of fictive account of a soldier called Hector MacDonald, who was a real life war hero. And it has been said that the Highland soldier is based on his image or his face. And Hector MacDonald tragically committed suicide, and he was homosexual. And I think there's a kind of quite a strong sort of reason to believe that there's a lot of like sort of tragic sort of repression associated with that, especially being in the army, and depression. And the novel sort of focuses on a sort of chance encounter that he has supposedly with Aleister Crowley in a Parisian hotel, which is quite a strange, interesting sort of book. And yeah, Jake did a sort of live performative reading from the book at Citizen M Hotel in Glasgow. That was one of the partnering sort of, so it's quite a really strange scenario, because Citizen M Hotel, it's like a very quite a tacky. So, but I guess it highlights how like sort of the festival,
Shiny, sure.
the festival's kind of like still to this day, I think, sort of tries to pack a lot into very small. But I enjoyed the project; it was really interesting. But I think the ideas were the most important thing, or the kind of getting together with those people. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that kind of it does seem that there is some research into kind of military histories that kind of runs into other projects that you've done since, but I'm not sure that that's going to kind of come up in the conversation, but perhaps we'll return to it. I wondered, again, still in this kind of vein of introducing your practice, I was thinking about the role of collaboration in your work. It feels like collaboration is a common thread, that it's something that's kind of ever present. For example, thinking of the music that you produce as part of your wider practice, but really the first aspect that I ever encountered visiting the working gallery spaces was the work that you produce with your mum. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the origins of that, but then also I wondered if that has shaped the subsequent collaborations or your mode of collaborating since then.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm not sure if I was aware of it at the time when I first started doing stuff, with my mum, for example. But having reflected on it a bit, I think it's to do with trying to make your own sort of context for things and not being so sort of, reliant on opportunities or waiting for them, or, fitting or sort of squeezing what you can into sort of existing, application sort of criteria, for example. Even though I think in Scotland, there's a lot of room to maneuver with in regards to, say, something like project funding or open project funding. I think there's a lot you can do there, but it's I think, and also actually taking that as an example, that application, I think, or that to me, for me, seems kind of like it's geared towards collaborative work. It's geared towards putting some sort of money back into the economy, or utilizing sort of skills that skill sets that other people might have. So making sort of your own context a little bit. I think also having sort of been to the art school in Glasgow, where there's a strong sort of historical sort of emphasis or like tradition on environmental art, or broadly sort of put like maybe socially engaged kind of work, where artists are encouraged to kind of like, again, think outside of a sort of gallery, studio, sort of a routine kind of way of working, and to put it in unusual contexts. So that was kind of, I've been surrounded by like artists that do that. And I just felt like, sometimes perhaps like the target of these sorts of projects are a bit maybe too removed for me or something. So I thought, well, actually, someone like a family member could also qualify as someone who would be seen as a target of engagement by sort of a so-called socially engaged project. So I just figured I could probably just maybe sort of make a point about who's kind of like maybe deemed an appropriate outreach sort of subject or something. But also it's like it's kind of if someone has varied skills, or kind of like a sort of a way of doing things, habitual way of doing things, it's so it's kind of curious. It's sort of, I see it as not an invitation to kind of go and like force a collaboration, but it's trying to sort of work out some terms and like see if it works. And it might never work, but the work might exist for a while, and it takes a bit of time for it to feel okay. And sometimes like having the sort of the press or the media attention after it can sort of help generate confidence in sort of people I'm collaborating with as well. So it might not always make any sense at the start, or it might feel a bit like manipulative or something, or maybe one-sided or something. But yeah, hopefully the point is that over time it will start to feel like natural. And some of the more recent things I've been doing, for example, this image here is related to a project I did with a dungeon synth artist in San Diego. This was over lockdown, so I'd never met this person. That's a tape that is coming out on Friday, actually, limited to 100 copies, a very small independent sort of label. But that, you know, that piece of music, I wrote a story for it, some of the artwork for it, and Vandalorum composed the music based on the sort of little sort of abstract story that I wrote. And that's gone back into this very, you know, small sort of like dungeon synth community, and people are kind of like, you know, using it in the way that they would other types of dungeon synth music. So that's kind of a newer step. And yeah, these are people I've never actually physically met. So it's just kind of, it's quite fun, I think. And I think like I'm kind of more, yeah, I'm sort of happy that, you know, that tape, for example, it won't, you know, it won't be sold as an edition, as an artwork. It's just a natural piece of, it's actually that part of whatever that culture is, you know.
I think maybe, oh, so on screen is one of the works that you produced with your mom, just for the sake of our audience. But in terms of moving on, I thought that it would be, if we could start to speak about some of the projects with printmakers. So yes, in 2019, you mounted a series of etchings and a new an artist film as part of the show Transparency, alongside fellow Glasgow-based artist Alberta Whittle. So the series Happy Punjabi Gothic was, we worked in etching in the print studios upstairs, translating drawings into print and then painting over the print itself. And my memory was that this was the first time that you were working with printmaking and etching. And I wondered if you could describe how that studio process felt for you. But then I'm going to tag a second question onto that first question, if that's okay, which was just that I had a sense, thinking about your practice, that you're moving more and more towards digital production methods. So when I think of your earlier work, I think of you doing a lot of drawing, whereas now some of that might be happening on, not that it's necessarily different, but in digital form. And I was wondering if the way that you perhaps went about creating that etching was actually like an analog translation, perhaps, of some of your digital processes. I was thinking of the way that you kind of layered on those etchings, like again and again. It felt a little bit how you might kind of produce something in Photoshop, for example. So sorry to throw two questions to you, but.
Yeah, well, the etching for the Transparency show was, again, similar, I suppose, to arguably connected to the way layers work in digital drawing. And also, I didn't actually undertake the process of, like, you know, transferring the plate onto, you know, print and paper and all that stuff. So there's a removed element there, which, again, so it's like, oh, I'm not super in control of that. I'm kind of maybe taking a step back and just sort of communicating with, you know, print technicians. But I did the sort of, yeah, the actual making the marks on the copper plate, which is, it's kind of similar to drawing a little bit. It, like, you are kind of, and especially the way I draw with ink and the pen, it's quite heavy, the marks that I make sometimes. And I'm using a needle in it. I'm sort of using a needle with dipped ink, like a nib, and but it is very different. Similarity. I mean, I have returned to drawing with ink again. I think it's probably something that I will do more of. Yeah, especially like after lockdown. I mentioned a dungeon synth project, and that was that comprised a series of like, 20 drawings or so. And I haven't done that for years. Partly because in between that time I've been sort of doing things in installations or context, or learning how to sort of do animations or music, and being very responsive to briefs that I've not really set, and also being invited to kind of like work with other people and sort of respond to sort of a curatorial kind of like idea, for example. Whereas with the drawings now, I can sort of hopefully start to kind of like, just get back to what I think I'm probably good at or best at. And it's also quite like, it doesn't really require much sort of space and tools, it's very simple to me, and probably kind of like not obscene in terms of, generating waste. That's one thing actually I wanted to talk about is, I don't really, every time you sort of see on a drawing, there'll be like some black or lots of ink or some bits of colored in, it's because I probably like made a mistake on it. So I've just decided to kind of color over it. And then that will just sort of maybe assist me with like working out what I want to put in certain places in the drawing. And similarly with the print, there was, I wasn't aware of what it was at the time, but Jody, technician, said that the prints had been foul bitten, which is a term that means something, I think it's to do with, I'm going to sound really silly now, but I don't really know what it means, but I think it's to do with some sort of like the way the acid reacts to in that process, and it makes the sort of whole print have like a grey kind of a tint, like a sort of really weird, like not sort of a kind of a rough like texture on top of it. But I kind of like, I see it seemed to sort of make sense to give it sort of an antiquated like look or something, and also maybe concealed some of the imperfections of the drawing itself, which was quite convenient for me, because I didn't have much time to sort of experiment with etching plates and stuff. I don't know, so and I don't know what foul, I don't know where it means, like foul bitten, but I kind of like the what it could mean, seemed to tonally sort of like seems to fit some of the kind of content or imagery I was trying to generate with that series, Punjabi Gothic series that I'm talking about.
Yeah, it felt very serendipitous. I think it was a really interesting kind of happening in that process. Maybe we could say something about the content of that series. I remember that you were looking at particular imagery featuring chains from the West Midlands, but also thinking about Gagandranath Tagore and some of his historic kind of satirical drawings, critical, his critiques of the kind of colonial school system. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the content of the etchings for the audience.
So there's a few that sort of depict, I guess, might look like a monkey to some people, but it's just sort of a generic kind of like humanoid kind of figure, a hairy sort of like character doing sort of contorting its body and presenting its kind of like body in sort of strange sort of ways. I can't remember what I was thinking exactly, but I think I had this idea of making, was it Happy Punjabi Gothic, which is thinking a lot about the consumption and sort of ubiquity of like sort of Gothic kind of like subcultural kind of like images, and like sort of sort of the romantic and the comedic and the kind of less sort of macabre, but more quite like sort of like softer kind of like forms, and like maybe even sort of things that are kind of appropriate for young people. Yeah, and because I do a lot of, I've made references to sort of video games and like cartoons, and yeah, some of that work may appear to sort of be quite benign on the surface. Yeah, and I figured I was trying to work out like a sort of way of maybe making a relationship between the way in classic sort of Gothic texts, the way family sort of dysfunction and historical kind of like inherited sort of trauma kind of like work, but put it in a sort of South Asian setting. So I was just sort of brainstorming kind of like characters, and I think that the hairiness comes from yeah, I don't know if this is actually what I was thinking, but it could be like because Sikhs don't traditionally cut their hair, and the sort of way I draw hair with undulating sort of ink lines, it's yeah, it's something that's kind of, and the way I shade and the way I do, the way I like make marks, it kind of seemed to fit. And then the chains, you know, lots of characters have these chains on their noses, and I guess that comes from the way that ceremoniously, like South Asians sort of adorned, particularly women, are adorned during weddings and things like that, to sort of. But I think it's sort of unwittingly kind of like maybe it's like a symbol of doom or something in a lot of contexts, because it's like I suppose a lot of times it's quite an old kind of traditional imposition, and probably like it's like a sort of trap maybe for certain people, and the chains are kind of like about that. And then there's one image that refers specifically to a Gaganandranath Tagore drawing. I didn't really know much about him at all, you know, quite recently around that show, and sort of was just really kind of like excited by the idea of a kind of you know, pre sort of partition kind of like, I guess you would call him like a middle class sort of Indian elite who would make these sort of quite honest but quite pokey kind of like satirical drawings. So I was just kind of like, you know, just excited by sort of knowing about this. And the image that I referenced for the show was about yeah, I guess like the sort of, well, it could be right now as the sort of yeah, sort of commercialization, or the that neoliberal kind of effects of like, you know, the university structure and system, and yeah, that's, so you have this kind of like factory school, which also has these like steamroller conveyor belt things, and these sort of bodies being churned out. It's just not very gory or that kind of that. But it's quite, yeah, the sort of idea behind it's quite grim, I suppose. So yeah, and then I suppose that's probably what links better, or like made this, probably why I got asked to do the project about the school prints, because you know, talking about education and sort of histories, like perhaps inheritance, yeah, and intergenerational kind of like effects of access to education, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I was having a look. If you go on the Goldsmiths, CCA, the gallery at Goldsmiths, you produced a work with them over lockdown, which seems to kind of carry on this trail of thought, which is a kind of critique of art school education. But also, I mean, over the last few years, you have been working in the art school, teaching. So it kind of seems to kind of be a critique of being on both sides of being both a student and a lecturer, kind of moving through that. And it wasn't really until I saw the CCA Goldsmiths video that because the school prints commission kind of predates my time with printmakers, I hadn't quite made that connection. But I thought it was, well, I mean, well, very timely, because I think that during lockdown and the way that things have had to go online, the way in which degree shows couldn't happen physically, there's obviously been a kind of increased agitation around, you know, what is an art school education and what is the offer. So that felt that felt really important.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it wasn't, yeah, so I guess it was like also trying to sort of reflect on perhaps, or make a point about how, you know, our education can be quite, you know, well, it has been formative in my development, transformational, and it's sort of making that kind of point that it is still as well. So it's not, you know, just purely kind of like critique. But it's, yeah, it's kind of, I think in that, yeah, in that video, there's like a student character and a lecturer sort of character, and they're having this sort of exchange in a studio sort of setting, typical kind of tutorial one-to-one kind of situation. But I wanted to make the student character like appear to be, you know, actually like you know, being a good student, like a good student, or kind of an interesting student, and not to sort of be kind of like cynical about, yeah, sort of art school so much. So that was a part of it, I think. Also, just like it's kind of strange about how random it is. You know, it can be quite random at what you get, because, you know, especially artists that are teaching, you know, they don't know everything, because then, like, you know, and there's no real, I mean, maybe there are some sort of courses that lecturers do, or maybe they will do a PhD or something, which is becoming perhaps more of a requirement. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's sometimes you know, you can say it doesn't work with in certain situations. It just, yeah, and that's quite risky, I suppose, for maybe the management or the university structure, or the people that are kind of doing all the
yeah, I mean, I think there's a conversation. I mean, my own experience of my undergrad was that from the second year, you were doing primarily self-directed study, it was called.
Yeah.
There was like a lecture program to the side of that, but generally it was just, you know, here's a studio, get on with it. But what was it? You know, how to go about getting on with something. So I think it's, in some respects, it kind of throws you in the deep end, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I guess, yeah, there's obviously that wider kind of conversation about skills, kind of production, like technical facilities, those kind of things. That's, yeah, you know, I think it kind of, if they're not being given in the formal way, it means that people have to go and kind of seek them out. And, you know, for various reasons that some people will manage to and others won't. But just because I'm kind of mindful of time, I wanted to start to talk about transparency, the way that you kind of were working with print through that project, and then have kind of continued to since then. I wondered if you could say something to the significance of printmaking for your practice, or perhaps the same question, another angle, to say something about what printmaking means to you now.
I think like it's, you know, there's something about the studio situation and the routine of it, which it does, I can see like how that can be very seductive, and like quite perhaps people can obsess over it, and I kind of get that, because it is quite if you can master it to a degree, it must be really satisfying. And I feel that way about like other media, more so, arguably, particularly with drawing and like working out digital animation and things. But yeah, I mean, it's like a very satisfying kind of thing to get right, I imagine. And you know, I'm kind of like maybe shooting myself in the foot a bit, because I kind of have done a lot of like drawings of similar things, or like characters recurringly over and over again, out of perhaps obsessiveness, you know, when I could just be making prints, because you only have to make one and then you can kind of like do so the reproducibility perhaps is what I'm talking about, which is it's, I guess there's uses to it, obviously, but maybe that's kind of one thing that I didn't, maybe that was inhibiting like my kind of interest in it from earlier on, because you know, kind of wanting to sort of like sit down and just keep working in the studio and making new things and like making accidents and stuff. Yeah, I think it's important, but I feel like at this stage it's perhaps a bit removed from my sort of you know, bread and butter sort of like a way of working. But that could change, you know, if I have more time with the process. Yeah, but overseeing it, I do have an appreciation for it and people that are working primarily with print. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that what I thought was a print edition that you'd made with David Dale, and I assumed that it was screen prints or lithograph. And I remember you telling me, no, I just drew the same image out like again and again and again for the edition. So
yeah, I just didn't think to do it. I just drew it like 10 or 6 times or whatever it was. And but it probably was quick. But I mean, obviously there's inconsistencies with each one, so each one is unique. But I quite like that. I suppose arguably it's the same with prints, but it's it can't be exactly the same, but it's the same enough for it to be, you know, a print. So it's kind of a funny distinction. It's funny, because I think like people look at the work and think, oh, that would be an amazing print. But I guess it's frustrating from my perspective sometimes, because well, it's a drawing. It's accepted as a drawing. So yeah, and I'm going into it kind of like not blind, but I suppose like just a bit. I know there's a lot more to it. I'm not going to kind of like pretend or claim that I'm kind of, you know, I'm fully kind of like aware of what's drawing me to it at the moment, or where it can go.
No, I mean, it's so interesting, because I think that there's something about some of the qualities of your drawing as well that I think, you know, as with the school print series, they just lend themselves so well to various printmaking media. So there's something interesting going on there. I wondered, so the British Art Show has just closed, and you're currently part of a show at Very Contemporary, your gallery. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you're working on just now, or things that you have coming up in the future.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's going to be a show about in London at Somerset House, a big sort of like group exhibition about the Beano comic. So I guess it's like, yeah, and I think that seems sort of relevant to this, you know, this talk. But I think again, I haven't read the Beano, like, and I was kind of like reluctant to sort of be a part of it, because I was worried that I would be one of very few artists whose work would be sort of like perhaps subsumed or kind of absorbed into something that it wasn't really kind of about. But I've decided to sort of like I had a few ideas, and I thought, well, and we had a few conversations, and it's, yeah, I think it's kind of, I realized that, but that's okay. And whether I'm aware of like my influences to a degree, I guess it's the thing, it's like, I know about the Beano, I know what it is, but I've never read it, because that's how big the influence is and stuff. So that's kind of strange. So I kind of was a bit resistant to it at the start, but then I had an idea for like to sort of run a sort of new sort of like series of drawings. Yeah, but that'll be kind of an interesting show, I think, because they're building like these rooms that in each one sort of supposed to physically embody or feel like you're in a comics. And I think it will there'll be like a serious kind of like historical appraisal, like sort of, yeah, I think Andy Holden, who's curating it, has spent a lot of time sort of with the history, and is quite knowledgeable about that. So yeah, but again, it's kind of like a bit of a unknown for me as well. So I don't really know, but I'm interested what that looks like. And there'll be lots of like, you know, comic artists or contemporary artists that have some sort of like sensibility connected to the Beano, in form of like dissent and sort of maybe rule, kind of like playing around with rules and stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, I mean, I can see why it's kind of challenging, and as a kind of commission, it would be quite, it could feel a little bit like left of field. But I mean, obviously in terms of the aesthetic of your work, but just that way that you kind of mine particular visual cultures, it seems like, so is that coming up, is that this year or for next year?
It's this year, it's on the 21st of October, it opens, and it's on till the 6th of March. So, okay. Yeah.
That sounds great. Well, I'm going to stop sharing our slides so that we can begin to move into the Q&A. So just going to change our settings here. And please feel free to start typing in any questions that you might have for Hardeep. I'm going to enjoy my liberty of being the host and kind of ask a first question, which is actually something that I meant to kind of bring into the beginning when we were talking about your practice. But in terms of kind of your I've always thought that where you work kind of somehow is shaping what you're making, whether that's kind of in scale or format. I remember that you worked kind of had like a home-based studio for a long time, but you also have worked in kind of like studio kind of complexes in Glasgow. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where you choose to work and how that shapes what you're making, or the kind of rationale behind that. Obviously, in terms of printmaking, as you were talking to earlier, so much of that is about being in the building and working in that community, but you seem to like to kind of go between being in that kind of like public studio space, but also do a lot of work from home.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like the flats that, in Glasgow, they're quite big, compared to sort of what I grew up with in Birmingham. So I don't think I need like a lot in terms of space. And I've elected, pretty much to sort of, I've spent a lot of time doing small drawings and through choice, and at school I had exposure to sort of like different things and studio practices and workshops and things like that. But I was kind of just elected for that particular way of working, probably because I don't know, I think it's just maybe probably like out of like a worry or acknowledgement that it's unrealistic to sort of like maybe go into art school with like a very specific kind of like thing that you want to do, say for example big sort of fabrication or things that require a lot of resources, and just being sort of maybe like aware that I probably won't have that after, so I just need to find something that I can pretty much do wherever I am almost, and be a bit sort of be a bit kind of flexible, and I guess like more recently, I mean throughout my sort of throughout the projects I've been working on over the last few years, I've been doing sort of site-specific kind of like wall drawings and things like that, and that gives me a chance to sort of actually go and sort of meet people in the gallery or meet other artists who might be there at the time, and sort of it's a nice way of short-circuiting the kind of like what it would be like otherwise, and I think it kind of like, especially like if you're not sure about whether you're gonna get like paid, or say for example, if you want to like do the show outside of the UK and you want to go to it, if you propose to do a wall drawing, then they have to send you there. So this little weird sort of things that make it. I think it's just like, but then it all comes out of compromise. It's not, it's all a compromise because it's, it means that it's you end up sort of, redoing it or having to do it because people expect it. So, but with drawing, I'm really happy with, where I am with it at the moment. Yeah, and I think I quite like being in that zone because I can listen to music usually when I'm doing it, and that gives me a chance to do that properly, or listen to podcasts, yeah, it's and it's quite satisfying to feel like you're thinking as well in that space, and it's not transactional. It's not like, oh, I'm going to pay someone to do this for me, this kind of thing, or yeah. And all the studios have been quite sort of essentially little offices which have storage space and then some desk space to do drawings in. Yeah, and I do digital stuff at home because it's just a bit bigger, and like I just always worry that studio's going to get flooded, basically, because they always do. So
yeah, it's kind of typical Glasgow. No, somehow still standing studio space, hole in the wall kind of studio space. We've had one question that's come in, which asks about the podcast that you listen to when you work.
I should have prefaced that I don't listen to many podcasts, but the ones that I do, they tend to be very, very sort of like specifically about video games, or there's one that I was listening to about the TV show Sopranos, which was quite so this is like, yeah, just trash basically. I don't listen to like I do know of a few kind of interesting ones. There's a few newspapers do one like about like internet and stuff like that I came across, but I don't know what it is. I can't listen to them when I'm on the move or at home because I think I just zone out, because I'd rather just read an article when I'm free. But the Sopranos one, if you're into the TV show, is really good because they analysed every single episode, and they're doing 86, and it's like 2 or 3 hours long each one, and it's like probably the most comprehensive like analysis of a TV show I've ever come across. So it's remarkable in that respect, but it is is very kind of like entertaining essentially for me if you're into that thing. But yeah, and then listen to lots of music. Yeah.
Thanks, Ina, for the question. So when you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about an artist that we had in residence at Edinburgh Printmakers over the summer, who, instead of kind of describing themselves as an artist in residence, described themselves as a disruptor in residence. And I was thinking about the way in which, when we were discussing transparency and Gagarindranath Tagore's drawings, you were talking about them being they were satirical and pokey. And I guess I think I was wondering if you could talk about your own, I mean, within all of your work, there is a kind of forcing, I guess, there's an institutional critique that's there for sure, a critique of the structures of the art world, the kind of inclusion exclusions of the art world. But in some respects, it can be very overt, but in other ways, it's very subtle. And I wondered if you could say something about the rationale in terms of how you decide to go about that. I mean, there's many different ways in which people force the art world to think about, or the art school to think about some of these questions. You kind of do it a little bit covertly.
Yeah, I think it's maybe to do with just like trying to be honest as much as possible, and be a bit like sort of aware of maybe expectations that people might have of you, and presumptions, and I think that's where it comes from. mostly. I think a lot of times people have sort of seen some of my work and then met me and this will like have said to me, oh, I didn't expect it to be like this. I thought you'd be more like your work, which is quite a revealing sort of thing, because I think that people think that they need to, I don't know, it's like, I think there's a lot of like concern about how one is perceived, especially now. Institutions are doing it as well, and I think optics and like, coolness and all that stuff, it just becomes kind of like mundane, after a while. And it's just, well, I think I enjoy when you get a sense of someone being quite honest about it, whatever they do. And so I thought, well, if I enjoy that, then I'm sure the people take something from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I was thinking a little bit about some of my own past writing, which is trying to ask specific questions, which is, maybe a different way of going about things, different practice. But it's yeah, I guess it's also really difficult to ask these prodding questions from the kind of inside, if you know what I mean. It's still going to be part of an artistic community, but still want to ask the difficult questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very aware that we're kind of fast running out of time. I wondered if we could talk a little bit about research methods, actually, because I know that we've kind of skipped over, in a way, the kind of mining of visual culture that's part of your work. But I mean, you're always the things that you kind of video games, the things that you watch, it's like you're almost like constantly taking things from the visual imagery that's around you. But it seems at other times been more formal kind of research methods. I remember coming to a talk that was part of the project you had, I think it was up at Antober. Yeah. And I remember that there was, I think it was an anthropologist who was kind of speaking alongside you, because in that project, there was a lot of beheading, and the two of you were kind of going through this kind of history of the headless figure in kind of art history and visual culture. But I know that you have kind of looked to an extent at kind of official archive sources, but I wondered if you could just talk about your research methods. Is a lot of it online? Is it what's immediately around you, or?
I think it has been sort of, like looking at sort of things that, like just trying to, each project will perhaps, like, for example, the one at Antoba was, sort of focused around like severed heads, because that was, it's prevalent in some of my work, and some of the imagery that I kind of referenced earlier on depicts it. And it was a good opportunity to do that, and not be so focused on, kind of a specific kind of like, say, cultural thing related to ethnicity, or, so it seemed like transcultural phenomenon, which would make it relatable potentially, because I was worried that in Coma, Antoba, which is in Tobermory, which is a place that I don't really have any kind of connection to, there was a lot of conversation around, like, what would I do essentially, and how could it be sort of expansive and kind of inviting perhaps, for a broader perhaps audience. So I'm speculating, I'm being presumptuous, but yeah, I mean, I come across sort of things that I like to read, and then with exhibitions, institutions can afford artists to sort of like invite people that you've like looked at or read or you heard about or about, and it makes it easier, unless if you don't have a platform or a profile perhaps. And it's mostly for like, it's mostly just that kind of activity is to just communicate that it's not just all in my head. There's being quite honest about that, where I picked up things or who's responsible for even the research, or, you know, and then hopefully they can just do it. They can just come in and like provide whatever it is that they're doing, and it becomes a bit of an advert for them as well if it's useful. Yeah. So it's not, I don't know if I've got a formal method as such. I sort of say in my statement that there's associative thinking, but it's not, it's quite vague. I don't think, because I know that there are different schools of it, and I don't know too much about all the different sort of schools, but I think one can just like maybe get a good sense of what that is just by reading the phrase, you know. Associative thinking is kind of what
yeah, I guess I was thinking about in advance of that 2019 project for printmakers being because Castle Mills was the North British Rubber Company, and the archives of that are now held in Dumfries, just because of some of the way that kind of company kind of slowly closed down in various stages, I guess. But yeah, I remember kind of being there, and, you know, there's all of these kind of very formally trained archivists. And I kind of remember being like, you know, what are we supposed to be doing here? Like, you know,
yeah.
But I think it's kind of like an interesting question to ask, actually, because I guess, you know, you enter into these very formal environments in which kind of feels like, similar to gallery, we're all supposed to know how to act and kind of what route to follow and how to be going about this, but it kind of assumes that kind of assumption, that's an assumption underpinning lots of these experiences. So that's what I was thinking of. But we have come to time this evening. So I just wanted to close by saying thank you so much, Hardeep, for joining us tonight. And it's been really great to talk with you. Thank you very much, everyone. And have a good night. Thanks, Hardeep.